Good morning, everyone. Almost on time. It's my delight to welcome you to the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harman, recovering politician, and President and CEO of the center, and we do our best to have programming that we feel identifies and highlights the important people and the important issues in Washington, so this is a twofer. And we just, some of us, finished a breakfast with very significant women and a few men in the science fields, talking to Dr. Cordova, and you will get the benefit of that in about 3 minutes when she starts to talk. But many very distinguished women were in that room. I just want to single out one whom I know is here, but I don't see her this second, and that is Rita Caldwell. She's way in the back. Well, why aren't you right here? Here. Rita Caldwell, who was the 11th National Science Foundation director, and set the path for a lot of the progress that women have made in science fields. So what happened to Rita? Is Rita coming? She's coming. Okay. She needs to be right here. Here she comes. Good. And she's writing a new book about women in science. Get ready. So, let me mention a few other things, which is that we have 2 programs at the Wilson Center which are relevant to today's event. First, we have a women's platform which has produced a power to parity index that shows not only what positions women have in governments around the world, but what power they hold. That's something that no one has done. We're up to 75 countries, more to come, and that program is directed by Gwen Young. Where's Gwen Young? Right there, who also happens to be a woman. And our second program is our Science, Technology, and Innovation program, which analyzes and translates advances in science and technology fields through innovative programming like serious games, hackathons, and highly regarded training for congressional staff. We have trained 500 congressional staff, bipartisan, bicameral, in topics like cyber and artificial intelligence. And these are in groups of 50 for a 6-week course on Friday afternoons. And we think that we're the only game in town providing real information about very hard subjects to women and men staff in Congress. The director of that program, called STIP, also happens to be a woman, Meg King. So it is now my delight to introduce Dr. France Crdova, an astrophysicist, why not, and the 14th director of the National Science Foundation. Her resume is dazzling. President Emerita of Purdue, Chancellor Emerita of the University of California, Riverside, NASA's chief scientist, a Kilby laureate, can't see anything anymore, and PhD from Caltech, and in fact, it's so daunting, it's scary. The title of today's event is Curiosity to Discovery, a topic that means different things to each of you. In her case, she's a scientist. In my case, as I mentioned, I'm a recovering politician who still tries to operate as a developer of actionable policy ideas. It takes curiosity to discover the best innovations in both fields. Dr. Cordova will make a few remarks, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then she will take your questions. So please welcome the 14th Director of the National Science Foundation, Dr. France Crdova.
All right, can you hear me all? Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, President and Congresswoman Harman. This is great to be with you this morning. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life leading up to becoming the director of the National Science Foundation. So I'll start with this beginning of a poem, and I'll tell you about the poem. And I'll also end my remarks with the end of the poem. Poets and true pathfinders have traveled like this. So what inspired me as a young person was poetry, and I think that poetry has kind of figured in some way through my entire life. It's been what has inspired me and kept me going when I've had challenges, and it's what led me to become an English major at Stanford University. And that is where I met the woman who wrote this poem, who wrote Poets and Pathfinders Have Traveled Like This. She was Leslie Ullum, who is an active poet today, has written all kinds of wonderful things. And the way we met was interesting. We both wanted to be writers. We both admired the writings of women like Sylvia Plath and Joan Didion. And we realized that independently, we were very different universities, that both of them had entered a writing contest when they were in college. And that contest was called the Mademoiselle Magazine Guest Editorship. That was the contest of the day, and I see some of you nodding your heads to remember that one. And I was determined to become a guest editor. And so I wrote out of my experience, because one thing I've always believed is that you don't just have an experience, but you actually try to articulate it. And then it becomes solid, it becomes fixed, it becomes part of you. So I wrote out of my experience working in Oaxaca, Mexico one summer, doing anthropology field work among the Zapotecs there. I did a study of the sociology of their bilingualism, Zapotec and Spanish. And so I wrote a story called The Women of Santo Domingo, and that got me into the guest editorship. There were about a dozen of us. And Leslie Ullum wrote her poetry. And so we met in New York City and went on to Israel, which is where they took us that year to write the August issue of the magazine, which was famous for being entirely produced by guest editors, college-age people. And I was the guest travel editor because I loved to travel. I had spent 6 months in Italy translating the poems of an Italian poet into English. I had done the episode in Mexico, the field work. And so now I was in Israel and wrote that story. Well, my years in college were very brief. I was anxious to graduate and leave and do something active. I had majored in English, and I want to step back for a minute and say, how is it? And even yesterday, my husband turned to me because we were talking about this opportunity to be with you today. And he said, yes, how did you become the director of the National Science Foundation? I want to go back to my youth growing up in California. I was the oldest of a lot of children, 7 sisters and 5 brothers. And that really shaped my, it shaped my life in probably more ways than anything else, because I was always in charge. My parents were very religious. They went out of the house to do their religious work a lot, and so I was left to care for children. In those days, we had we didn't have shirts that were perma-pressed, so that meant you ironed all the uniform shirts, and that was my job. We didn't have disposable diapers. That meant you folded all the diapers, and there were a lot of diapers when you're the oldest of 12, so that was my job too. So I learned to be busy and to love being busy. And that's also characterized my work habits. And I think I really inherited a lot of that from my father, who was just worked intensely hard, started his own company in California, and it's still being run today by one of my brothers. And my mother married when she was quite young, just out of high school, to my my father, and was whisked off to Europe, where I and three of my siblings were born. So she didn't get a chance to go to college until she was 40 years old and had all those children. She went back to college, became one of the 10 outstanding students in her class, and started 2 companies. So she was my inspiration for being an entrepreneurial person, but she was also my inspiration for what eventually led me into science. And that's that she was constantly with the books of famous theologians. She was always asking questions about the universe. She had no science background, but she wanted to deeply understand the meaning of things, the origins of the cosmos, the origins of us. And so I was brought up in a household with a workaholic father and a mother who was deeply spiritual and always asking the big questions. As I said, loved poetry, I loved literature, and those were really my guides and my salvation going through schools, my retreat. And so it was only natural when I went to Stanford that I would major in something like that. I had the inklings of being a scientist from a young child. I did science fair projects. I remember when I was in the 7th grade opening up the World Book encyclopedia. That was before Google, and that's how you got your information. And I saw the picture of the Bohr model of the hydrogen atom, and I thought it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen, and asked myself, how do people know this stuff? I mean, how do they investigate something so small? And then later in high school, I did a project on lasers, which had just come into the fore. Little did I know that the National Science Foundation had funded all of Charlestown's work for decades, and he was the inventor of the maser and then the laser. Little did I know that NSF would turn those discoveries into really useful devices, popularizing barcodes and laser eye surgeries, funding centers that, engineering research centers that really carried that into brilliant technologies that helped people. So I really loved science in high school. I had no mentors and no teachers that supported that interest. In fact, they very much, we women were discouraged from going into science. We were told that, oh, there's this ugly thing called graduate school where you have to really buckle down and shut everything out of your life and just really focus and study. And surely you want to go to college and find a nice young man and get that MRS degree. And so that was also in the days before Ms. And so I entered Stanford as the first woman from my high school to do so, and majored in English. And it was that summer of being the Mademoiselle guest editor that lasted for a month. Then I was back east doing an education project. I'd been accepted to graduate school in anthropology at Stanford, but decided to put that off while I kind of explored things a bit. So I was doing a project back there, and then there was the moon landing. And that was mesmerizing for me. Again, the question of, how do people do that? How do they have these big dreams and then actualize them and make this happen, and what kind of technology got us there? And right after that, I saw the really defining thing that changed my path, and that was on television, public television. I saw a special on neutron stars. So this picture behind me is just of a woman looking up at the sky. It reminds me of when I was a youngster and I had a big picture window beside my bed, and I would watch the sky, and the stars seemed to gently move through the night. But also there were these big searchlights. Does anybody remember those big searchlights that would cross the sky? And they were usually advertising the opening of a supermarket, big box store or something. But for me, those were kind of, I thought of them as searchlights from the heavens, just illuminating it more clearly. And interestingly, that's what neutron stars turn out to be. That Jocelyn Bell Burnell, a 23-year-old student in Cambridge, England, had just discovered these searchlights in the sky, these pulses that came from somewhere out there. And here was a person from an MIT scientist on TV telling the world that these were probably not little green men, but they were neutron stars. That's collapsed stars that were the mass of the sun, or maybe a little bit, maybe 1.5 times the mass of the sun, but all compressed into a volume the size of this city. So intensely strong gravitational fields and sending out big beams as they rotated around. And when I saw that and I heard the story, and when I heard the scientist, Paul Joss, describe the amount of energy that would be liberated when a marshmallow dropped onto a neutron star, that was it. It was that marshmallow that got me the next day in a bus down Mass Avenue towards MIT and asking for a job there. Well, I was hired on the spot. Little did I know it had nothing to do with my science background, which was nothing. But it was because I was an English major, and the professor who hired me was writing the first review of X-ray astronomy, and he appreciated having an English major there in the laboratory. So I got to do science in the laboratory, be really exposed to the latest in X-ray astronomy. This was on balloon flights. They had some data. And I got to dream about becoming a scientist. I was accepted as a graduate student at large at MIT, but I decided that I wanted to be back with my family in California. So I went over to Caltech, which was literally in my backyard, and I asked for a job. And I knew who the professors were from doing this, helping the scientist at MIT with his review, and they gave me a job in a computer lab. I had no idea anything about computers, but I was handed a Fortran 4 manual. Anybody remember that? And I thought, boy, this doodles, that looks pretty simple. I could do that. And so I got to get involved in programming and analyzing programs and putting them together for X-ray rocket flights, and which the group did. And they let me take courses there on an auditing basis, and I wanted to be graded for the courses and do the exams, and I did very well. And so they admitted me to graduate school. They said, don't take the GREs. That's not going to be helpful. We're just going to admit you and see how you do. And so I was possessed by that time. I absolutely loved science. And becoming a graduate student there, I learned so many things that have been helpful in my tenure as NSF director. I learned how important it is to support graduate students, to have the freedom of inquiry, and to have good mentorship, and to have other opportunities, which I made possible when I got to NSF finally, of having experiences abroad so that they could work in other laboratories, internships with companies and the like. So every part of my career, and you'll see it has a lot of different paths, I learned something that I could take with me and then bring eventually to NSF. Nothing was wasted. So when I graduated from Caltech, I took the one job that was permanent, in the sense that it was a staff job, not a postdoc. I had been offered a number of those, but I took a permanent job at a Department of Energy laboratory, Los Alamos National Laboratory. And I took it for that reason, because it promised a longer tenure, and because when I first saw Los Alamos and I gave a talk there, I thought it was the most beautiful place on earth. And I think any of you who have seen it, you either love it or you don't. And so I wanted to be there. And I have to say, it was such a great experience as a woman to have that long run out and not to be after just a couple of years of hopping around doing a series of postdocs, which is what you do in physics. That was my degree at Caltech. I had, it was actually in studying these degenerate stars like neutron stars and white dwarf stars, black holes, and doing rocket launches and analyzing satellite data from X-ray satellites. And so I brought all that with me to Los Alamos, which had was kind of a dual-purpose lab. It was naturally on the national defense and security issues, but it was also using satellites to observe the heavens. And that is the place where I was really able to grow as a scientist. I met my husband doing my favorite sport that I learned at Stanford, which was rock climbing. And one day when I was doing my climb and he was doing his, we were both on belay, which means you have somebody holding the rope, so if you fall, you don't fall too far. And he swung over on his rope and introduced himself to me. And he said the only safe thing that a man in that situation can say, he said, "I like your shoes," my rock climbing shoes. So I met my husband, we had our 2 children there, and I was able to really enjoy a family life as well as get really into science and feel like I had the long time to get into it deeply, and the lab was very, very supportive. I also learned how important work-life balance is, and that's something I took with me to the National Science Foundation, that it's very important to give all people, and women in particular who have children, and an opportunity to still go to conferences, and an opportunity to win awards, and so on. And so a couple of the things we have done at the National Science Foundation is to, first on our early career awards, they used to just be for people within 5 years of their PhD that they were qualified to get these very important awards for research and education. Well, we changed that. We dropped that requirement entirely, and now the requirement is only that you're in the assistant professor track, and so that's really opened up things for women. We also attached a work-life balance grant. If you got a career grant, you could get money to go to conferences and use the money for, say, daycare. And in the case of awards, we have at the National Science Foundation a famous award named after the first NSF director called the Alan T. Waterman Award. And that is for the person young person who's been absolutely outstanding in their research. And they get not only the award, but $1 million for their research. And for years and years, that award had not gone to a woman. There were only a few out of the 40 years, maybe 5. And people were asking why. And I got email when I was at NSF from women who said, well, look, it's because of the requirement that you have to be under 35 years of age or within 5 years of the PhD. And this comes at the most awkward time for women when they're starting families and all. So that experience at Los Alamos and starting my own family and realizing what kinds of pressures there were led me to propose to our National Science Board, which is our policy arm, that we change that restriction and that we expand it to 40 years of age and or 10 years from the PhD. And lo and behold, we just did that a couple of years ago. The very next year, which was last year, the first woman in like 2 decades got the awards. And she would not have gotten it had we had the previous conditions on it. So it was opening up the conditions. And she also was a social and behavioral scientist, and I believe the first psychologist to ever win the award. And just to verify that we had really made the right decision, the MacArthur Prize was awarded to her in this past round as well. So definitely a most deserving candidate. And there are many other deserving candidates out there. But I use this as an example that it's things in your life, the different places you are, as a pathfinder on these different roads, that when you get to your final destinations, that make you review policies, make you look at making change, because you remember how it was for people when in a different era when you were in that same situation. So from Los Alamos, I went on to, I started on a university track after 10 years, but it was absolutely wonderful foundation for that. So I went as head of the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics to the Pennsylvania State University, and I think if you're going to be the only woman in the department, as I was, then you should be the head of the department, just to make sure that everything would go all right. From there, I was on various national committees, and the head of NASA asked me to interview for the position of chief scientist. I was very reluctant to leave academia, even though it was just going to be for 3 years as a rotator. And but I didn't want to get out of science, out of the university departments, faculty, and all that. And it was really going back to my mother. I asked her, because she knew me better than anyone, and she said, "France, how can you talk about how important it is for women to be in science and not accept a platform where you can really move that along and speak about the importance of that?" And so that's what did it. After talking to dozens of my colleagues who all pointed in the other direction, I went and was chief scientist for NASA. The NASA experience really introduced me to policy. I didn't even know what that word meant when I went to Washington, D.C., but I got very immersed in policy. I was the chair of an all-agency committee that looked at research misconduct and formulated an all-agency definition of research misconduct, which really changed things up in that field, and that was very good. That was a very good way to understand in my present job, when we were confronted with all the sexual harassment news that was going on, how one might go about changing things for the better, and how one might affect policy that an agency could do, that was in our swim lane to do, and make a real breakthrough there for people that were really having a hard time, and we were losing to the field because of sexual harassment. So again, my experience in one place informed my experience eventually as an NSF director. So from NASA and all the wonderful things we were able to do, and all the big ideas we were able to have, I got to start with the NASA director a whole seminar on having big ideas, which I have taken over to the National Science Foundation, and now we have our 10 Big Ideas platform, where we are trying to further breakthroughs, transformative breakthroughs in some areas where the country could, and indeed the whole world, could use some transformation. So from NASA, I then went on my university leadership track in administration. And every one of those positions, I learned something that I've been able to carry over to the National Science Foundation. At UC Santa Barbara, I started a program called Research Across the Disciplines. It was the beginning of convergence, although we didn't have that word in the vocabulary at that time. And now convergence is one of our 10 big ideas. It's all the disciplines getting together and attacking a common problem with perhaps different solutions and different approaches, but all going in that direction. And it is really making a difference, I think, in science is the convergence approach today. From UC Riverside, where I was chancellor, I learned much more about the importance of diversity and inclusion, and that's just an amazing university, which is the most diverse of the UC campuses and has been heralded nationwide for its approach to inclusion, a very, very diverse student body, and learning how to navigate that and to make it a rich environment for all students was incredibly important. And it's a delicate subject. It's arguably harder than rocket science. And then I went on to Purdue University, where I was president and the first woman to become so. And I have to say, it's so nice at NSF not to be the first woman director. That is Rita Caldwell's moniker. So at Purdue, I was pleased to be the principal investigator for our advanced program. Advance is something that was started a long time ago at the National Science Foundation, and it is to encourage women in the professoriate to go from entry-level position all the way up and to take on senior positions. And so, and that is a program that we're continually re-upping and refurbishing and ensuring that it sustains because it's had such important institutional impact on women at universities. And so from Purdue University, I went on to be board chair of the Smithsonian Board of Regents. And what did I learn there? I learned the importance of engagement and leveraging with museums and with institutions that do public communication of science very, very well. National Science Foundation, what we do is we fund things. We get 50,000 proposals a year. We can only fund 20% of them. So we have to choose wisely. And we try to choose programs that really leverage opportunities for the most people. And certainly our partnership with the Smithsonian today and our partnership with many museums across the country and other vehicles and institutions, foundations that are concerned and with the public communication of science as being so important to reach everyone has been a very important thing to learn how to expand and how to work with. So then I did arrive actually through the Smithsonian to my present position. And that was because the Smithsonian Board of Regents, I don't know how many people know this, but it has 6 senators and congressmen on the board. And they're all part of the authorization, the appropriations process. And when they saw me in my position as board chair, they thought that I could possibly contribute in another way to governance and public service. And so I think it was they were quiet about it, proposed to the administration that they look at me for this position, and they did. And so I've been at the National Science Foundation for nearly 5 years now. In a 6-year tenure position, nominated by the President of the United States and approved by the entire Senate. At the National Science Foundation, I'm just so thrilled that our mission is all about basic research, about supporting the most fundamental research. It's also about trying to translate that research or move it along out into the public domain through a variety of innovative ways. So we fund, in addition to funding single investigators and small teams of investigators, we fund whole centers, large centers that have a piece of research that they'd like to do where they can envision what would be the uses of it, how would it make a difference in people's lives. And so we fund, in addition to those things, we fund big tools to make it possible to do the next level of exploration. Tools like research ships around the world, tools like big telescopes and big accelerators and all. And I want to tell you for just a moment about big ideas, to go back to my youth and my aspirations and my rock climbing. Because as I would sit at the top of these rocks that I would eventually climb up, I climbed a lot in Yosemite because it's relatively near Stanford, and I would look out over everything. And I would recall a poem by Emily Dickinson that said, "The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain, with ease, and you besides." And the brain is something that we study at National Science Foundation, even in it of itself. We study also the brain in action with others and how it makes decisions. And we study that whole universe of possibilities that is wider than the sky, that is deeper than the sea, as her poem goes on to say, that is just the magic that is out there. And in order to do that, we have to have people, a staff that is just driven by the mission of furthering the progress of science. And I'm very fortunate to be director of an institution where people are all working together towards those goals. They are choosing research that really matters, that makes a difference. And that's hard to do when you have 50,000 proposals. And you're also continuing proposals from past years. So there's a lot in there. We depend on the science and engineering communities to really help us make those decisions. We depend most of all on the brains, the talent that is everywhere. One of our 10 big ideas is called Includes. And for me, it's the most important of the big ideas. We have our other big ideas are about the next quantum leap in quantum research, about artificial intelligence, about navigating the Arctic, because that's where all the climate change is going on, about understanding the rules of life, because we want to predict phenotype. But to me, the most important of the big ideas is focused on the people who will have the next big ideas for the future. So let me close with the last part of Leslie Ullman's poem. She says, and this is relevant to the theme of my talk, which is taking everything that you've experienced, everything that you've collected with you, because it all makes a difference for your next step. So remember, she is the one who started out, poets and true pathfinders have traveled like this. So she ends with, "I am collected now into one worn suitcase, and the healing conviction that everything left with me is absolutely relevant." Thank you.
Thank you, France. I was looking out and seeing all the heads nodding, and I think of the many events we've had here during my tenure, which is heading to 8 years, very few of our speakers start with their own stories. And storytelling is a hugely powerful part of teaching and communicating, and obviously by doing it that way, you got the crowd. Speaking of crowd, there are some couches on the side here to my right, and there are a few empty seats, one in the front row. I won't call on you if you sit in the front row, it's okay. But please, you don't have to stand. You can move around, and there's an empty seat in the third row. I can see it right here. So no one is listening to me. I haven't told a story, but hey. The other announcement I have is that the NSF has brought over 2 virtual reality systems called Oculus Rift. They are next door. Holly Brown of the NSF is standing there. Next door means through the back door of this room. And if you want some virtual reality, we're not talking about fake virtual reality, we're talking about virtual reality, you can go next door and try this stuff out. So please think about that before you leave. I have lots of questions, but you answered some of them as you spoke, because some of mine were personal about work-life balance and where your curiosity comes from. But let me just ask another question about your family. So 11 other siblings. We had a brief conversation about that. One is unfortunately no longer living, but 10 other siblings. Anybody else catch the science bug?
No. But we have had a chairman of the Federal Reserve, one of the Federal Reserves. So they've definitely caught the financial bug, the entrepreneurial one from my parents.
Anybody catch the poetry bug? And let me make a comment there. My late husband, Sidney Harman, some of you may know the name from a theater downtown and other things that he did in this city, always used to say about the businesses he started, get me some poets. And he would try to hire, literally, poets, because his view was that poets were the original systems thinkers, and that poetry isn't just something you read that's beautiful, but poetry is a way of thinking that makes you much more useful in an enterprise. So just curious, that's the theme here. Got any poets at the NSF, or any poets in your family?
Well, I'm sure we have poets at the NSF. We have one who loves poetry, Ann Kinney, who is the first woman to head our Math and Physical Sciences Directorate, sitting right here. And she begins her narratives with poetry, and recently shared a book of poetry from an astrophysicist who is no longer with us, and it's a deeply beautiful book. I understand what you mean about poetry, because it calls for a certain precision, and I have to share with you yesterday when I wrote to Leslie Ullum and asked her if I could share her poem, and she said yes, because it had only been, for a long time since, and it doesn't appear in any of her more recent published works. And then she said something very interesting. She said, I can't believe I used the word healing for healing conviction. She said, I wouldn't use that word today. And I thought, that's just like a poet. No, you wouldn't use the same word, because you're precise, and you've thought about words very deeply in the structure of words. So what your husband was saying.
Yeah, well, he loved poetry. He quoted it all the time. Do we have any poets in the audience here today? Yes, wonderful. Well, you're going to get called on first, and you have to explain what you do, because we're all interested. All right, well, let's go to a few more of my questions, and then turn to the audience. You mentioned that you came across policy later in your career path, but how important is science as a public policy driver?
I think science, engineering, technology is incredibly important. It's in today's world, because it's so much dependent on science and technology. If you don't know it or appreciate it, at least know enough, it's hard to make decisions that are very, very important. Now, NSF is not in and of itself a policy institution, except, of course, we do have policies through our grant-making process. Our sexual harassment policy that I mentioned is one prominent example. But we're our research agency, but we inform public policy on my service on the National Science and Technology Council, and there I co-chair half of the committees of the National Science and Technology Council, and also co-chair some other committees for the administration that are about policy. It's very important to move forward as a country that we have good science basis for making the kind of policy decisions that are required.
Well, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about our shared home state of California, ravaged by fires. I mean, we have to, and you mentioned your work in the Arctic, we absolutely have to understand climate change, which is a science-based activity, don't we? In order to get, if it's possible, ahead of this, horrible change in our climate around the world.
We have to understand the planet that we're living on, at least as well and hopefully a lot better than we understand the cosmos. As fond as I am of the cosmos and black holes and neutron stars and the like, as fond as I am of understanding the origin of the universe, I think we arguably understand more about that now than we do about our own planet. And we're going to have to understand the changes that are happening in our planet, the reasons for them, do very good, thorough observations of them in order to know how to be resilient, what to do, what not to do, and so on.
Well, you mentioned the Arctic. Let me just stick on this a moment, and your work there. We have a polar initiative here. It surprised me to learn, it shows that I was underinformed, I now know a little more, that we have a new ocean, which is the Arctic Ocean. And how do we have that? Because the polar ice cap is melting twice as fast as, and other climate is changing twice as fast there as in other parts of the world. And this gigantic ocean is something that could be a shipping channel and probably will be between Asia and Europe. Did you know? I mean, the Panama Canal no longer will be the shortest or possibly best route. Huge climate issues around it, huge security issues, you know, the ethnic tribes in the area and so on and so forth. 8 countries bordering this ocean. So what is NSF doing with respect to the Arctic?
So first, I just got back from the Arctic Science Ministerial that was held in Berlin this year. It was the second such ministerial. The first was in our country in late 2016. And this was a convocation of about 20 ministers, obviously the 8 Arctic nations, but also many, many other nations are concerned with both the challenges and the opportunities in the Arctic, and the 6 indigenous populations of the Arctic were also represented there by their leadership. And so we talked about all the things that are necessary in what we call at NSF, navigating the new Arctic. That's one of our big ideas, and we are putting a lot of money into, and just released a call for proposals to better understand in an observational sense what is happening in the Arctic, and also to understand better how we can work with the indigenous peoples there, because unlike the Antarctica, where we also have a lot of bases, we run the 3 US bases in Antarctica, there are no people there other than researchers, scientists, and their support staff. But in the Arctic, as you said, that they're full of people there who make their livelihood there, and things are changing very, very rapidly for them. What is happening in the Arctic, the changes that are happening there are twice as fast as the rest of the planet, and everything that happens there is feeds back into the changes that are happening all over the planet. So this is something that we are committed to doing more and better research on, and we're committed through our engagements with other countries to working hand in hand with them. So we signed a ministerial statement of all the Arctic nations there, that we would be sharing data, we would be sharing infrastructure, like all the research centers that are around and the ships and so on, the different ways of exploring the Arctic, and sharing a commitment to better understand and to help the citizens of those countries.
Well, just to, to put an end point on this conversation about the Arctic affecting all the rest of us, my residence, official residence, is still Venice Beach, California. Eat your heart out. But it's in a now posted tsunami zone. There hasn't been one yet, but the thought is that the seas are rising and the weather is changing, and it could be one, and it's very flat between the Pacific Ocean and my house. And so I know I'm in a tsunami zone, and we all have to adjust to changing climate and related activity.
And beyond adjustment, there's the research to really understand what's going on and what we can do about it. So we are funding a lot of research about tsunamis and hurricanes and fires and so on. And
well, we're seeing them in real time. This is not just a hypothetical exercise at all anymore. Couple of more questions before we call on the poet. Get ready. STEM, you sort of mentioned it, but we didn't really talk about it. And at breakfast this morning, people were talking about the need to focus from preschool on especially getting women and minorities into STEM topics and persistence. Can you explain that to this audience?
Well, I think the situation for getting women and underrepresented minorities into STEM is much improved now over the past decade or 2 decades. There's a real commitment to it on the part of the federal government, but on the part of lots of foundations, clearly universities, community colleges, K through 12, and so on. There are programs everywhere. When I got to the National Science Foundation, I felt discouraged that we were funding a lot of STEM programs, STEM education programs, at all phases of the so-called pipeline, although, as we discussed this morning, the pipeline is actually a very jagged path. But we weren't moving the needle, and the needle has to be moved. And we can see today that other countries are putting a lot of investment into STEM education, and they are their commitment is growing. The students are now the worldwide students who could go to school almost anywhere are making have a variety of decisions to make about where they go to school, and it's not always going to be here. We really need to put the focus on our own population, our own young people, and encourage more of them to go into these amazing careers. I just couldn't believe when I finally discovered the universe, STEM, everything, that I didn't know about this before, that nobody came to my school to talk about it. My parents didn't know anything about it. Nobody in the family did. And so for me, it was simply exposure to it that made a real difference. I think now what we're learning, because there is more and more exposure, there are programs like NSF has the program called Includes that I mentioned, in order to fund pilot programs around the country to encourage people in all different fields and different communities to come together and to raise students up to understand, learn about STEM, have opportunities for them. But what we're discovering, the real problem now is on persistence, that people get into STEM, women and underrepresented minorities, but it's sometimes hard to stay in STEM. So I recall another writer, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince, who said, if you want people to build a boat, don't just give them a lot of the hardware to build the boat, the wood and the metal and so forth, but teach them to long for the immensity of the sea. And I think that's what we really need to do, is we need to have those visions out there. I mean, how would I, as a young person, have known that I could have had the career that I have, that I could be a professor at wonderful universities, that I could make a discovery. When I was in graduate school, I had the experience of being the first person to ever discover X-ray pulsations from white dwarf stars that were accreting from companion stars. And that was, for me, a eureka moment. And how to talk with young people about experiencing those kinds of moments and having careers that have endless possibilities, getting them to persist through those calculus courses and engineering 101 and everything. And so as administrators at universities, we try to work harder with the faculty to make our courses more endearing, and so that the transition point between first and second year, second to third year, and the transition after graduation were points of where people persisted instead of dropped off.
So mentors, a big part of creating of promoting the ability to imagine oneself in a career. And I think all of us can talk about mentors. Back in my day, there were very few women mentors, but there were a few, and they made a huge difference to me. But being the first and only woman is not enough, certainly not to me, and I'm sure not to you. Having a critical mass of women all along the path is I think, the major driver of dreams for little girls. And in that context, I want to mention Congress. All of a sudden, there will be, imagine, more than 100 women. Many are diverse. A few are scientists. Just imagine that. And they will be all over the Congress. So my question is, what difference will that make? But also, is Congress, and I know the answer to this is no, but what should Congress do to be more helpful to NSF and to the other science agencies in our government?
On the first question, I think that women will bring some new questions and concerns for sure. I've heard since the election people talk about why they believe they were elected, and they are very responsive to their communities and the community needs. And I come from a state, New Mexico, that's where my permanent home is, which has great needs in education. And in fact, I'm committed, once I leave my present position, to really help in every way I can with that. I think I've already heard from so many women who are presently in Congress, they ask a lot of questions about the classroom, about what we've learned about STEM education, and what are useful things that they can bring back to teachers in their districts. And they'll want to see some of the things that we're contemplating at NSF is how to get more of the knowledge that we have funded for so long that has reached important conclusions, how to get that out into the public in clearer, more accessible ways. As we discussed again at breakfast, that a lot of what we learn goes into these very select, abstruse journals, and they help further people's careers. They get promoted and wonderful results. Oh, that's a real insight, and so on. But how do we get that information out of that journal and into the public domain? And that's something that I'm really committed to now, is to figuring that out. And we can't figure it out by ourselves. We're going to have to pose that question to people and have them come up with the ideas for curated, trustworthy repositories of knowledge so that the lessons learned can be shared and we can answer the questions of these congresswomen. But I think diversity always makes a difference to really answer your questions, and I'm looking forward to the new Congress and what it brings.
Well, I'm hoping it will bring something, including bipartisanship, civility, some good ideas, just imagine, and some innovative solutions to the many problems we face. But maybe that's just me. Raise your hand if you disagree. Okay, my final question is, emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing don't precisely fit into academic boxes. What should this audience know about technologies like this and their impact on science, and whether the U.S. is well positioned to be the leader in the world in these technologies?
Yeah, well, it's a very important question. Several of our big ideas hinge around artificial intelligence, for example, especially machine learning. I think it's the thread that ties together all of our big ideas. It is going to make a huge difference in every field you can think of because they're all producing a lot of data. How do we learn from the data with our the tools? Our brains may be wider than the sky, but they do have their limits. And when it comes to big data, it's very helpful to have machines to assist us. And just right now, we depend so much on some rudimentary forms of artificial intelligence like Siri or Alexa. And artificial intelligence, of course, is in the Amazon. I was yesterday shopping on Amazon, and it's this, wouldn't you like these other things, France? We know your habits, and surely you would like to go back here and get another one of these. And so it's everywhere already. And there is such a race to really exploit what more artificial intelligence can do, to really be of service to us, to not replace people, but to assist them. So, for example, I've got a couple of school teachers in the family, my daughter and my daughter-in-law, And can you imagine the smart classroom of the future where artificial intelligence can help do the rote things for teachers and they can really focus on the students? You can think of for people that are aged and that need a lot more help. Artificial intelligence can help. In every place, the future of work can really depends on using artificial intelligence well and wisely. And quantum research is, well, that is kind of my field. I'm a physicist, and actually the quantum world has been with us for 100 years. And we had the first quantum revolution. It's in the handbags of everybody here, and some people are holding it. The electronic revolution that understanding quantum science has led to. And now it's time for the next quantum leap, because the properties of the quantum world are such, they're so exotic, and there's so many new ones that have been discovered. And NSF has actually, interestingly, 31 of the Nobel Prizes in quantum science have been through NSF funding. So that's an amazing statistic. And actually, since on the number, 236 Nobel Prizes in general have been funded by the National Science Foundation. So what we fund matters, and that goes back to a point Rita Caldwell made at breakfast about funding. And so the quantum world
It might be
offers
worth
immense
repeating that
possibilities.
point that she made
Well,
about NSF's funding compared to funding of other programs.
Well, I'm not in a position to do that.
Okay,
but
well,
she
I'm
is.
calling on Rita
She
second
is.
after the
So we'll
poet
let
to make her
do that.
point.
Yes.
Okay. Just one last comment on AI, though. It's one of the subjects we teach here on Friday afternoons to Hill staff, but there's an underside to AI, too.
Sure.
You said
Yes.
Wise use of
Yes.
AI.
Yes.
It can be used to create algorithms that are both fake and dangerous to us
Yes.
if it is not properly managed.
Yes, and today or tomorrow, we're going to be putting out a call for proposals, and one of the people involved in that call is Skip Lupia here, who heads our social and behavioral research. Another person is head of our computer and information sciences division, and they are together putting out a call to have proposals that look at just that, at the social and ethical consequences of artificial intelligence.
Okay, now we get to hear from our one poet in the entire room, I guess our second, maybe our speaker, but please identify yourself, very interested in, are you really a practicing poet, or why are you here? Who are you?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Cordova. Thank you, Congresswoman Harman, for this amazing talk. I am a scientist. I work in the federal government in this building. I am a public health practitioner, also a writer since I was young. I do have published work out there right now.
And what's your name?
Cynthia McOliver.
Uh-huh.
And I'm sorry, I'm shaking, I'm so nervous. But
Oh.
I have worked on projects with NSF collaborators and others. And I think the point you made about diversity inclusion, about students being supported, about Arctic research are all of interest to me. I just wanted to say thank you for a great talk. And I think the one point I wanted to make is about science translation. We all want to publish, we all want to advance, but if no one can find our research, if no one has heard about your agency or organization, there's no point to it. So I really want to encourage Dr. Cordova and your ongoing exciting work is to potentially develop some solicitations focused on science translations, work with science teachers at elementary, college, graduate levels to translate existing work. So my agency works on environmental health, public health.
And what's your agency?
EPA.
Okay.
So there's amazing work being done at the EPA and other agencies, but no one can find them sometimes because they're not, scientists, or they don't subscribe to journals. What's the possibility of providing these publications for free?
Very
across
important point.
different, what's the possibility of making the publications accessible? Because everyone can't read at the doctoral level. What's the possibility of incorporating a science translation aspect to the research grant? working with the communications team or with educators. I think that would be really useful to a lot of people.
Very, very
But
important
thank
point.
you for,
Thank
I mean,
you.
I was nodding, I was making notes. Everything
Yep.
you said really resonates with me, and I'm happy to have been a part of this presentation today.
Well, thank you for
Thank
coming.
you so much.
Now, Dr. Caldwell, please just make the point you made at breakfast about the disparity in funding.
I think it's important to point out that the NSF budget is $7 billion. The NIH budget is $36 billion. I'm in the process of writing a book on women in science, and it turns out that this disparity, this lack of funding, this underfunding of the National Science Foundation actually is detrimental to women, because the opportunities that NSF offers and the egalitarian way that the funding, because having been there, I know that, is made, really women benefit. And now I'm going to run because I have to chair another meeting.
course
But
you
this
do.
has been terrific.
Oh, that's
Thanks
great.
very much.
Well, we're delighted to have you. So let's, we have a bit more time. Please identify yourself, ask a question. That would be helpful. And we'll try to get through some more questions. Who would like to ask a question? Really? Way in the back. On my left side.
Hi, thanks, Jane. Dr. Cordova, thank you for a great speech, and thank you for bringing a few of your grantees over to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce the other day for our IP Champions Gala. You know, looking around the room.
Identify yourself.
I'm sorry, I'm Patrick Kilbride with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Looking around the room, it's obvious that you're a real inspiration to women. And so a question for you and for the audience, how do you think we're doing as a society, particularly here in America?
That's a simple little question. One sentence answer would do fine.
So what exactly was?
Use the mic.
Okay.
He asked, how are we doing as a society?
How are we doing
How
as
are
a society for women?
America.
Yeah.
Well, talk from your vantage point as someone who's navigated this society and, you know, quite brilliantly. And we know how you're doing, but how do you think the rest of us are doing?
I would say that when I play Sudoku, when I'm about to take off in an airplane or land, which are, you know, the most frightening moments. So I play something that's very intense, so it absorbs all my concentration. And I check to see if I've marked a wrong box, and it comes back with its little artificial intelligence thing and says, everything is just fine. So I'm tempted to say everything is just fine, but of course we know it isn't. We know that we're very, very fortunate to be in this country where we have so much freedom of movement, of collaboration, of partnerships, and this is an era today where partnerships are more important now than ever before, and we all want the same kinds of outcomes. And so I see very creative partnerships blossoming between the Chamber of Commerce and the National Science Foundation, between private foundations, between small businesses and large businesses and all of our different directorates. And I think that those kinds of partnerships are really moving the needle. So I've been accused of being a very optimistic person, but I think that's a survival strategy, by the way. But I think that I feel very good that people are pointed in the direction of improving things for others. That's our commitment as public servants, but it's also the commitment that a lot of people out there in all sorts of walks of life have, that they really want to help out, and they just need some direction.
Well, I would just add, though, thinking about that everything is not fine for people in their cars trying to escape these fires.
Yeah,
and other, you know, both climate and related tragedies in this country, and leveraging science to do more about these problems, I think would be something necessary. How do you do that? You need more funding, but you also need more kids with big imaginations, bigger than the sky, going into science fields and coming up with the most innovative ideas, don't we?
Right, absolutely we do. And we do have some programs called Rapids and Eagers, which are programs for people with just bright ideas that want to explore new areas, or in the case of Rapids, in response to fires and hurricanes and floods, to get in there with a proposal very quickly, and we evaluate them almost on the spot, and we can get funds to those people. So we are trying to be a bigger world of embracing what the public is really interested in doing, and if they can come up with a proposal that looks like it's credible, we're investing in it.
Well, you know, we do serious games here because we're trying to get more people into trying to solve the hard problems. And you mentioned landing on the moon. I remember that too. And I remember when President Kennedy announced that we were going to go to the moon, and he said, we're doing this not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And that has always stuck with me. And I think that there are people who really want to try to solve hard problems. Yeah. And some of them live in disparate, disadvantaged communities and need the same chance the rest of us had, and probably could be the next Nobel Prize winners or the winner of the big NSF grant or whatever else. Any more questions? Because Gwen, I'm going to call on you last, and Meg, if she's still here, to add anything you would like to add. Yes, right here.
Hi. I'm also very nervous. I'll just introduce myself first. My name is Liza Wilson. I'm 19 years old, and I'm a research assistant here at the Wilson Center. I work with the Polar Initiative, and I'm an environmental science major at American University. And I'm also, like, obviously interested in polar issues. And so I guess, and also I also do Sudoku on planes, so I wanted to make that. But one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is the intersections between policy and science that you mentioned briefly. And even though I don't really need to worry about this right now, I've often been worried about how will the things that I'm interested in and the research that I do moving on in my career, how will I actually make a difference with those things if I don't first understand policy and how to intersect science and policy? So I just kind of wanted to hear your take on that. So
yeah, well, I think it's great that you're thinking in that way. I think in order to do that, I've always thought it's very helpful to have a deep understanding of some discipline, because you can bring that to the policy world, okay? More and more, we find young people like you are very interested in policy and taking their skill sets out to where it can make a difference. And there are increasing opportunities to do that. I was at UC Riverside only this past week giving a lecture, and there's a woman there who used to be, she was in fact the first dean of engineering. She also headed up for all of California their Science Policy Institute, and now she's back, retired from that, at UC Riverside, where she started a whole credential program for young people who are in all kinds of disciplines to learn more about how to make policy and affect policy. And I thought that's just a great thing to see that kind of thing spring up. The AAAS, and I know there are folks here from the AAAS, has a AAAS Fellows Program, which is all about policy. And we fund that program substantially. We have at any time 40 AAAS Fellows spread throughout the National Science Foundation, making an incredible difference. When I get together with those people and I see what they're doing, it connected with whether it's computer and information science or biology, astronomy, they are really out to change the world. And they're just here they're spread throughout the federal government, but they're learning a skill set in real time by being embedded in our federal government agencies that will serve them well when they get into other environments. So I encourage you to look at those kinds of programs, because they really do give you the tools for thinking about policy.
And delighted to have you at the Wilson Center, where we focus on serious research and deep scholarship to create actionable ideas for policymakers. There is a path here, and I'm very glad you're on it. Anybody else have a question? Let's take one there, and then we'll have Gwen close this.
Hi, I'm Laurel Cookshouse. I'm an ASME Congressional Fellow for the year in the AAAS program, and on sabbatical from my university position where I teach mechanical engineering. Your tale of poetry weaving its way throughout your life, and we have another poet in the room. My other thing that I do is that I play music. And I see that we have this leaky pipeline problem. What can we do as multidisciplinary scientists to communicate to young people in the pipeline that you can do science and, whether that's science and poetry, science and arts, science and music, how can we use that to our advantage and make it more visible to fix some of the leaks in the pipeline?
Well, I should turn that around to you and everybody else here, because you all have a different way of doing that. I was once at a breakfast years ago with all women leaders, and we went around the table and everybody told the story of how they got to their position. And there were just no two identical stories. And they were interwoven with all kinds of things. It was just magical. And if people, young people that are wondering what will become of me, what am I growing into, if they heard those stories and realized that there really is no such thing as a pipeline where you have a narrow pipe and goes from one end to the other, that you can go back and forth. And I think the theme of my remarks was that everything that you learn along the way or experience, whether it's music or poetry or rock climbing or skiing, it's all a part and parcel of who you are, who you become, and you can bring that to a new environment. And that's why diversity is so very important, because we all bring those very different backgrounds into the place, as they say in Hamilton, the room where it happens.
Thank you, Dr. Cordova, and thank you, Jane Harman. It's been a wonderful day, and I think a perfect example of two women leaders of government agencies, both dedicated to deep scholarship and expertise, but policy and thinking big. And I think these stories about, I loved the theme. I talk a lot in the women's leadership work that I do, that women don't stay in one sector and one career, that you go in and out of both. We talk a lot about sharing best practices across the globe and across policy areas. And I think this notion of what works and what doesn't work. And the notion of this pathways piece, how do you get to where you are? Who are you? What do you bring to the table is incredibly important. And I just also like to emphasize the piece about the policies that need to change. The piece that about you bring your big skies ideas and you bring your expertise, but there are certain criteria, certain policies, certain institutions that have to change to allow that. And so I'd like everyone to join me in a round of applause, because these are two women that are changing policies, institutions, and systems.